When did a funeral go terribly wrong? My neighbor Anna knocked on my door one morning looking desperate. She offered me $200 to attend her aunt's funeral that afternoon and pretend to be a grieving friend. Apparently appearances really mattered to their family, and an empty funeral would bring shame upon the whole bloodline or whatever. She gave me a brief bio of her aunt to memorize, and emphasized that at no point should I mention and definitely not interact with her aunt's son, Dylan. He'd been unstable since his mother died. Apparently Dylan had been questioned by police about the death, but they couldn't prove anything. I needed the money and figured I could sit in a church for an hour, so that wasn't enough to scare me away. But then I arrived at the funeral home. It was almost empty. Dylan sat alone in the second row, rocking slightly back and forth while staring at his mother's casket. He was younger than I expected, maybe 25, wearing a suit that didn't fit right and muttering something under his breath. When I signed the guest book with the fake name Anna gave me, Dylan's head snapped around to watch me write. My hand started shaking as I finished the signature, and I chose a seat near the back, close to the exit. During the opening prayers, Dylan kept turning to look at each attendee, studying faces like he was memorizing them. The priest seemed nervous and rushed through the initial remarks, glancing at Dylan between sentences. When it came time for family to speak, Dylan stood up before anyone else could move, his chair scraping loud against the floor. He walked to the podium slowly, running his hand along his mother's casket as he passed. His eulogy started normal enough, talking about his mother's garden and her love of birds, but then he said she would still be here if certain people hadn't abandoned her. Anna's family shifted uncomfortably as Dylan's voice got louder. Everyone in this room knows what they did, how they left her to suffer alone while they lived their perfect lives. He started pointing at specific relatives, naming their sins. Aunt Anna, who wouldn't lend her money for medicine. Uncle Robert, who called her a burden. Cousin Sarah, who blocked her phone calls. My stomach dropped as I realized this wasn't grief, but rage, and I started calculating how fast I could reach the door. The priest tried to intervene, but Dylan grabbed the podium with both hands and kept going, his voice getting more unhinged. She begged all of you for help, and you let her die alone in that house, probably grateful she was finally gone. Someone's baby started crying, and Dylan screamed, "Shut up!" so loud the stained glass windows seemed to shake. The mother rushed out with the child while Dylan watched, then said, "That's right, leave, just like you all left her." I wanted to follow her so badly, but knew moving would draw his attention to me. Anna was typing furiously on her phone, probably texting someone to call security, while Dylan pulled out a stack of papers from his jacket. I have here every email, every text, every voicemail she left begging for help that you all ignored. He started reading them out loud, his mother's desperate words echoing in the church, while relatives began standing to leave. But Dylan stepped down from the podium and stood in the center aisle, blocking the path. My legs tensed, ready to run, but I was trapped in the middle of the pew, with no way out, except past him. "Nobody leaves until I'm finished," he said, reaching into his jacket again. The priest said something about calling the police, and Dylan laughed, this broken sound that made everyone freeze. "Go ahead, call them. They should know what really happened anyway." He walked over to the casket and put both hands on it, looking at each of us in turn. "You all culled her with your neglect, but one of you did more than that, didn't you?" When his eyes landed on me, I tried to look confused rather than terrified, remembering I was supposed to be a grieving friend. An old woman tried to edge toward the side door, but Dylan moved faster than seemed possible, slamming it shut and turning the lock. "My mother didn't just die," he said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper that was somehow worse than the screaming. "Someone in this room took her life, and the person who did it is sitting right here among us, pretending to grieve." He reached into his jacket again and pulled out a thick folder. "I have the proof right here. The medicine that was swapped, the doses that were changed, and I know exactly who did it." The $200 in my pocket felt like it was burning through my skin as I realized how badly I'd miscalculated taking this job. This guy was looking for someone suspicious, and I was literally a stranger crashing his mother's funeral. I was the obvious suspect. Dylan walked to the main entrance and locked it with a key from his pocket, then held up his phone showing he'd already called 911. "The police are on their way, but we're going to have our own trial first," he said, pulling something else from his jacket that caught the light. "Nobody leaves this church until I find out which one of you murdered my mother." The thing in his hand was a knife, not huge but big enough, and he held it loose at his side while his eyes moved across every face in the church. My heart hammered so hard I thought everyone could hear it, and I grabbed the pew in front of me to keep my hands steady. Dylan walked to the front row and pointed at an old man sitting there. "You? What's your name and how did you know my mother?" The old guy's voice shook as he said he was a distant cousin who hadn't visited in 3 years. Dylan made him stand up and explain why he stayed away so long. The cousin looked at the floor and admitted he stopped coming after Dylan's mother kept asking him for money. Dylan's face went dark and his hand tightened on the knife, but he moved to the next person, working down the row. I counted 14 people between him and me, trying to figure out what I'd say when he got to my seat. Anna's phone started buzzing over and over, and Dylan spun around and yelled at her to turn it off. She fumbled with it, her hands shaking bad, and I saw the screen before it went black, showing missed calls from someone labeled security. The priest stepped forward with his hands up and suggested we all pray together for Dylan's mother's soul. Dylan laughed, this bitter sound that made my skin crawl. "Prayer won't bring her back or tell us who switched her heart pills with sugar pills." My stomach turned as he explained how he found the bottles hidden in her bathroom after she died. He'd tested them himself and found out someone had been replacing her medication bit by bit, making sure her heart would give out. Uncle Robert shifted in his seat and said, "Maybe she just forgot to take the real pills sometimes." Dylan slammed his hand down on a pew so hard that everyone jumped. "She was obsessive about her medication," he screamed. "She had a chart, alarms, everything." Through the stained glass windows, red and blue lights started flashing, and I could hear car doors slamming outside. The cops were here, but Dylan didn't didn't seem to care at all. He kept going with his interrogation, moving to the next person in line. My phone vibrated in my pocket, probably Anna trying to tell me what to say, but I didn't dare reach for it. I kept my eyes down and tried to look sad instead of scared out of my mind. Dylan reached the second row and stopped at a woman who looked about 60. She said she was from his mother's book club, but hadn't been to a meeting in months. Dylan got right in her face and demanded to know why she abandoned a sick woman who needed friends. The woman started crying and said she couldn't handle watching someone deteriorate like that. Dylan stepped back and looked disgusted. So you left her to die alone because it was too hard for you to watch? The woman nodded through her tears, and Dylan moved on to the next person. Outside, someone was using a megaphone, but I couldn't make out the words through the thick church walls. Dylan ignored it completely, focused on his investigation. He questioned each person like a prosecutor, making them explain their relationship to his mother and why they weren't there when she needed them. One man admitted he owed her money and had been avoiding her. A woman said they'd had a fight about politics and stopped talking. Each confession made Dylan angrier, his knuckles white around the knife handle. When he finished the second row, he looked back at all of us. Every single one of you failed her, but one of you did more than that. He pulled out his phone and showed us a photo of pill bottles. These were supposed to keep her alive, but someone made sure they wouldn't. Anna was texting frantically now, not even trying to hide it, and I saw her type something about a back exit. But Dylan had already thought of that because he walked over and checked the side door again, making sure it was still locked. The priest tried once more to reason with him. Dylan, your mother wouldn't want this. She'd want you to find peace. Dylan spun around so fast the priest stepped back. You don't know what she wanted. None of you do, because none of you were there. He started toward the third row where I was sitting, and my whole body went cold. There were only 4 people ahead of me now. The first was an older woman who said she was a neighbor. Dylan asked her how often she checked on his mother. The woman admitted she hadn't visited in over a month because Dylan's mother had become paranoid and accused her of stealing. Dylan nodded like this confirmed something he already knew. She was paranoid because someone was gaslighting her, moving things in her house, making her think she was losing her mind. The next person was a younger guy who said he delivered groceries to her sometimes. Dylan questioned him about what he brought and when, taking notes on his phone. I wonder what Anna was thinking, sending someone to pose as a friend at this funeral when she clearly knew Dylan was unstable. There's something really off about this whole setup. Why would she need to pay someone $200 just to sit? The delivery guy mentioned that someone else had been ordering groceries for her lately, changing her usual orders. Dylan's eyes lit up like he'd found a clue. Who was ordering for her? The guy said he didn't know, just that the orders came through the app with different payment info. Dylan moved to the person right in front of me, and I could smell his sweat and something else, maybe fear or rage or both. The person in front of me started shaking as Dylan questioned them about visiting his mother last month. Their answers came out broken, and Dylan wrote everything down before moving on. A woman near the front row suddenly burst into tears, her shoulders heaving as she tried to speak. She managed to say something about how Dylan's mother had become too negative. Dylan's hand moved to his jacket pocket, and I saw his fingers wrap around something inside. The priest had been inching toward the side door during the questioning, taking tiny steps whenever Dylan looked away. Dylan's head snapped toward him, and he barked an order for the priest to sit down immediately. The priest froze mid-step, and Dylan pulled his hand from his pocket, holding a small knife that caught the light. He walked to the side door and pushed against it, showing us how it wouldn't budge. He jammed it from the outside before the service started, he explained, planning this whole thing. My heart pounded so hard I thought everyone could hear it as Dylan walked back to the center aisle. Sarah suddenly shot up from her seat 3 rows ahead of me, her voice cracking as she called this insane. She said grief was making Dylan paranoid and he needed help, not revenge. Dylan spun toward her so fast that several people gasped, pointing his finger at her face. He said she had access to his mother's house and worked at a pharmacy, making her the perfect suspect. Sarah's face went white as she admitted working at a pharmacy but insisted she'd never hurt her aunt. Dylan reached into his folder and pulled out a photo, holding it up for everyone to see. It showed Sarah's work ID badge next to a receipt for heart medication purchased with her employee discount. The date on the receipt was 2 weeks before his mother died. Sarah's mouth opened and closed like she was trying to speak, but no words came out. A man I hadn't noticed before spoke up from the back corner, identifying himself as the funeral home manager. He said we needed to let the police handle this situation properly. Dylan laughed, this harsh sound that made my skin crawl, saying the police already failed once. They didn't investigate properly when his mother died, so now he was doing their job for them. My stomach churned as I realized my turn was coming, and I'd have to explain how I knew his mother. The bio Anna gave me was just basic facts about her gardening and church activities. It wouldn't hold up under real questioning from someone who actually knew her life. Dylan moved to the next person, an elderly man who could barely stand from fear. The questioning went on for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Then Dylan pulled out his phone and held it up, pressing play on a voicemail. His mother's voice filled the church, weak and desperate, begging Anna for just $50 for groceries. The message continued, and we heard Anna's voice respond coldly that she was done enabling her sister. Anna's face went completely white as everyone turned to look at her. Dylan played another message, his mother sounding even weaker, mentioning that she hadn't eaten in 2 days. Then another where she begged Uncle Robert for help with her electric bill before they shut off her power. Uncle Robert stared at the floor as his wife grabbed his arm. Dylan kept playing messages, each one more desperate than the last. His mother's voice grew weaker in each recording, mentioning chest pains that kept her up at night. She described shortness of breath that made it hard to walk to the kitchen. Several relatives looked away or covered their faces as the messages played. One message had his mother crying, saying she could feel her heart skipping beats but couldn't afford the doctor. Another had her begging Sarah Sarah to pick up her prescription, saying she'd pay her back somehow. Sarah was crying now, shaking her head like she wanted to deny it all. The priest cleared his throat and offered to call Dylan's mother's doctor to verify her medical condition. Dylan said the doctor already confirmed she died of heart failure, which everyone knew. What he wanted to know was who caused that heart failure by denying her help and medicine. An older man I hadn't noticed before slowly stood up from a back pew. He identified himself as Dylan's mother's brother and said Dylan needed professional help. He insisted his sister's death was natural, and this paranoia was a symptom of Dylan's mental breakdown. Dylan's face turned red as he stared at his uncle, his hand tightening on the knife. The uncle kept talking, saying Dylan had always been unstable, even before his mother got sick. He mentioned incidents from Dylan's childhood, times he'd acted out violently or made false accusations. Dylan started walking toward his uncle, each step deliberate and measured. Everyone in the church seemed to hold their breath as Dylan got closer to the man. The uncle didn't back down, maintaining eye contact as Dylan approached him. When Dylan was just feet away, the uncle said something about getting Dylan committed for evaluation. That's when we heard the sirens getting closer, multiple police cars from the sound of it. Dylan stopped just inches from his uncle's face and reached into his folder again, pulling out a grainy black and white photo. His hands shook slightly as he held it up for everyone to see. The picture showed someone at a pharmacy counter, but the quality was so bad you could barely make out if it was a man or woman. Dylan pointed at the figure in the photo and then at Sarah, who was sitting 3 rows behind me. Sarah stood up fast, her purse falling off her lap and spilling lipstick and tissues across the floor. She kept shaking her head while Dylan walked toward her holding the photo higher. The timestamp on the photo said it was from 3 weeks before his mother died. Sarah grabbed the photo from his hands and stared at it, then held it up toward the stained glass windows, trying to get better light. Her face went pale as she looked closer at the blurry figure. Dylan's phone started ringing loud in the quiet church, and everyone jumped at the sudden noise. He looked at the screen, and his expression changed from angry to confused. After 3 more rings, he answered and immediately put it on speaker without saying hello. A woman's calm voice filled the church, introducing herself as Detective Cardenas. She asked Dylan to please let the elderly people and children leave the church right away. Dylan walked back toward the main door and stood in front of it with his arms crossed. He told the detective that nobody was leaving until someone confessed to killing his mother. The detective's voice stayed calm as she asked what evidence he had besides the medication that had been tampered with. Dylan set his phone on a pew and started pulling more papers from his folder. He said he found searches on his mother's computer for untraceable poisons from 2 days before she got sick. Anna suddenly gasped from her seat near the front and said his mother must have been researching for her mystery novels. She used to write them years ago and was always looking up weird stuff for her stories. Dylan laughed, but it wasn't a happy sound at all. He said his mother hadn't written anything in years because she was too sick and depressed to even get out of bed most days. The receipt he'd shown earlier was still sitting on the podium, and I could see it from my seat. Something about it looked wrong, and then I realized the pharmacy logo was different from the one where Sarah worked. My heart started racing as I tried to decide if I should say something or just stay quiet and hope he didn't notice me. Sarah suddenly jumped up again and said her friend Octavia worked at that pharmacy chain. She reached for her phone, even though Dylan had warned everyone not to use them earlier. Dylan watched as she scrolled through her contacts with shaking fingers. Sarah found the number and looked at Dylan, waiting to see if he'd stop her. He nodded once, and she dialed, putting it on speaker like he had with the detective. The phone rang 4 times before a woman answered, sounding confused about why Sarah was calling during work. Sarah's words came out in a rush, asking if anyone had used her employee information to buy heart medication 3 weeks ago. Octavia said she'd need to check the computer records, but it would take a few minutes to pull everything up. The church went completely silent, except for the sound of typing coming through Sarah's phone and the police radio chatter getting louder outside. We could all hear Octavia clicking through different screens and occasionally making little humming sounds as she searched. The detective's voice came back through Dylan's phone, asking about his relationship with his mother while we waited. Dylan's shoulders dropped a little as he admitted they fought all the time about her refusing to move to an assisted living place. He said he begged her every week to let him help, but she was too stubborn and proud to leave her house. His voice cracked when he said he would never hurt her, no matter how frustrated he got. Uncle Robert cleared his throat loud enough for everyone to hear and then stood up from his pew. He mentioned that Dylan's mother had changed her will just a month before she died. Instead of splitting everything between the family like she'd always planned, she left it all to Dylan. Several relatives turned in their seats to stare at Dylan with their mouths hanging open. Dylan's face went red, and he started yelling that he didn't even know about the will until after she died. The detective asked him to stay calm, but Dylan was pacing now, his footsteps echoing off the stone floor. How did Dylan get those voicemails if his mom was calling other people? That grainy pharmacy photo is making me think. Who took it, and why keep something so blurry? Sarah's phone made a noise, and Octavia said she found something in the system. Everyone leaned forward trying to hear better as Octavia explained someone had used Sarah's old employee code from when she worked there 5 years ago. The purchase was for the exact medication Dylan's mother had been taking, but in a different dosage. Sarah started crying and saying she hadn't worked there in years and didn't even remember her code. Dylan grabbed Sarah's phone and asked Octavia if there were security cameras that far back. Octavia said the footage was deleted after 30 days, but the transaction showed it was paid in cash. The detective on Dylan's phone said she needed everyone to stay calm until officers could arrive and take statements. Through the stained glass windows, we could see red and blue lights flashing as police cars pulled up outside. Dylan's face went bright red as he yanked papers from his folder and waved them at the room. The will change was dated 6 months ago, ago, way before his mother got really sick and he started yelling about how they only cared about her money. His phone buzzed and Octavia's voice came through the speaker saying someone had used an employee discount that day for the medicine purchase, but the name in their system was smudged and she could only tell it was paid in cash. The priest cleared his throat and asked real quiet if people could at least use the bathroom, and Dylan thought about it for a second before saying, okay, but only one at a time with the funeral home manager as an escort, starting with the old folks. An elderly woman stood up first, shaking as she walked toward the side door with the manager, and I saw her lean close to whisper something urgent to him as they passed Dylan's line of sight. Dylan's head snapped toward them, and he demanded to know what she'd said, his voice getting louder and more paranoid with each word. The manager tried to stay calm, but Dylan grabbed his arm, and the guy admitted she'd asked him to unlock a window in the bathroom so people could escape. Dylan completely lost it then, screaming at everyone to hand over their phones right now, and he grabbed a donation box from a pew and started going row by row collecting them. Anna tried to protest, but Dylan pointed the knife right at her face and said she was the one who benefited most from his mother's death because now there were no more begging calls and no more guilt trips. She handed over her phone while tears ran down her face, and then Dylan moved toward my row. When he got to me, his eyes narrowed and he asked my name, so I gave him the fake one Anna had told me to use, trying to keep my voice steady while remembering all the made-up details about our friendship. He asked how I knew his mother, and I told him we met at the library and bonded over mystery novels, my heart pounding as he asked which authors. I named a few popular ones I'd seen at the grocery store checkout, praying they were the right kind, and watched his face for any sign he didn't believe me. Dylan stared at me for what felt like forever before moving on to the next person, but my relief didn't last long because he announced he was going to check everyone's ID against the guest book to find anyone who didn't belong. The detective's voice came through his phone, asking if she could send in water and insulin for a diabetic person who needed it, and Dylan thought about it before agreeing, but only if one officer brought it alone and unarmed. The detective agreed, even though you could hear she didn't like it, and Dylan walked back to the front of the church to wait by the door. Everyone was looking at each other, trying to figure out what to do, and I could feel sweat running down my back as I realized I had no ID that matched the fake name I'd given. The old woman who'd gone to the bathroom was back in her seat, looking defeated, and the manager stood against the wall with his hands shaking. Dylan kept pacing between the casket and the door, muttering about how someone in this room was a killer, and he was going to prove it. My pocket felt like it was on fire where Anna's $200 sat folded up, and I started thinking about whether I should just confess I was hired to be here before he figured it out himself. But then I remembered what he'd said about his mother being murdered, and realized confessing might make me look like I was involved in something way worse than just crashing a funeral for money. The knife in Dylan's hand caught the light from the stained glass windows as he turned to face us again, and I could see fresh scratches on the blade like he'd been using it recently. Outside, more sirens were arriving, and through the windows, we could see cops setting up some kind of perimeter around the church. Dylan noticed too and laughed, saying they could surround the place all they wanted, but nobody was leaving until he found out who killed his mother. He walked over to Uncle Robert and demanded to see his ID first, and Robert fumbled with his wallet while his hands shook. Dylan compared the name to the guest book and moved on to the next person, getting closer to my row with each check. I tried to think of an excuse for why my ID wouldn't match, but my mind was completely blank with panic. Anna was crying harder now, probably realizing her plan to make the funeral look full was about to get me and maybe her in serious trouble. Dylan finished checking another person's ID and moved to the row in front of me, only 3 people away from discovering I didn't belong here. The detective's voice came through the phone again, saying the officer was ready to come in with the supplies, and Dylan walked to the door to unlock it, giving me a few more seconds to figure out what I was going to do when he got to me. The door opened, and a guy in a paramedic uniform walked in, carrying a box of water bottles and medical supplies. He moved through the room, checking on people, taking the old man's pulse, and giving him some glucose tablets from his kit. Dylan watched every move the paramedic made while still holding those IDs he'd been checking. The paramedic's name tag said Palmer, and he worked his way around the room real calm, like he'd done this 100 times before. When Palmer got to me, I scribbled a quick note on the back of a prayer card about that pharmacy receipt Sarah had shown earlier. Palmer took my pulse, and I pressed the note into his palm while he checked my wrist. He didn't react at all, just slipped it into his pocket and moved on to the next person. Dylan went back to checking IDs against the guest book, comparing each driver's license to what people had written when they came in. He was only 2 people away from me now, and my hands started sweating. The woman in front of me handed over her license, and Dylan studied it, then nodded and gave it back. Then he was standing right in front of me, holding out his hand for my ID. I pulled my wallet out slow, trying to think of what to say, and handed him my license. His eyes went from the license to the guest book, then back to the license, and his whole face changed. "This says your name is different from what you wrote," he said loud enough for everyone to hear. Every single person turned to look at me, and I felt my face get hot. "I sometimes use my middle name socially," I said, but even I could hear how fake that sounded. Dylan's hand with the knife started shaking, and he stepped closer to me. "You're lying," he said, and his voice had gone real quiet, which was worse than the yelling. "Who are you really, and why are you here?" The detective's voice came through the phone speaker, saying she had information about that pharmacy receipt. "I traced it to a different location entirely," she said. "Neither Sarah nor her friend works at that pharmacy." Dylan looked torn between dealing with me and this new information about the pharmacy. The priest cleared his throat and said, "Maybe I should explain myself fully to everyone." I knew I had no choice now. Everyone was staring at me, waiting for an answer. "Anna asked me to come," I said, and Anna's face went white. "She said she needed support support during the funeral. Dylan spun around to face Anna, so fast she took a step back. You brought strangers to my mother's funeral? His voice was getting louder with each word. Why would you need to bring outsiders to a family event? Anna started crying, and her hands were shaking as she tried to explain. I've been hiring people to attend family events for years, she said between sobs. Our family kept getting smaller, and I was so ashamed of how few of us were left. The room went dead silent for a second before everyone started talking at once. Uncle Robert looked disgusted and shook his head at Anna. Sarah actually laughed, this bitter sound that cut through all the other noise. This is so typical of you, Anna, Sarah said, always worried about how things look while our aunt was dying alone. That set everyone off, and suddenly the whole family was yelling at each other. Anna was sobbing about how she just wanted the family to seem normal and respectable. Uncle Robert was saying this was exactly why he stopped coming to family gatherings. Sarah kept bringing up every time Anna had chosen appearances over actually helping their aunt. Dylan stood in the middle of it all, still holding my license, looking like he didn't know what to do with all this new information. The priest tried to calm everyone down, but nobody was listening to him anymore. Palmer the paramedic had moved closer to the door and was talking quietly into his radio. The detective's voice came through the phone again, saying she needed Dylan to focus on the pharmacy lead. This is important, she said. The pharmacy where that receipt came from is connected to several other suspicious deaths. Dylan looked at the phone, then at me, then at his family tearing into each other. His mother's casket sat there in the middle of all this chaos, and I saw his face crumple for just a second. Palmer slipping that note into his pocket without even blinking makes me wonder if he's done this kind of thing before. The way Dylan's checking every ID against that guest book seems really careful for someone who just grabbed a knife and started making threats about his mom being murdered. Then he threw my license back at me and grabbed the phone to talk to the detective. Tell me everything about this pharmacy, he said, turning his back on the family fight. Anna was trying to defend herself, saying she just wanted their aunt to have a proper funeral with people there. Sarah shot back that their aunt would have preferred one real person over a room full of paid strangers. The relatives were taking sides now, some defending Anna and others attacking her. An older woman said Anna had always been fake, and this just proved it. Someone else said at least Anna showed up, which was more than half the family did. Palmer had opened the door, and 2 more paramedics came in, moving through the crowd, checking on people who looked upset. The detective was explaining something about prescription patterns, and Dylan was writing notes on his hand with a pen he'd grabbed from the podium. I sat there with my license in my lap, wondering if I should try to leave while everyone was distracted. But Dylan kept glancing back at me every few seconds like he wasn't done with me yet. The family fight was getting worse, and someone shoved someone else and a vase got knocked over. Water from the broken vase spread across the floor, while Uncle Robert grabbed someone's collar and Anna tried to pull them apart. Dylan watched the whole mess unfold, and something changed in his face, like he was seeing his family for the first time. The detective's phone buzzed, and she stepped away from the chaos to answer it, holding up one hand to get everyone's attention. Dylan's pen dropped from his hand and rolled under a pew as he looked around at all of us, at the fighting and the shouting and the broken flowers scattered everywhere. His shoulders started shaking, but it wasn't from anger anymore. It was something worse, like watching someone realize their whole world was a lie. The detective ended her call and walked back to the center of the room, pulling out her notebook. She said the pharmacy team found where that receipt came from, a little place near Shady Oaks Assisted Living, the facility Dylan had been begging his mom to move into for months. The purchase was cash, no credit card trail, but the pharmacist remembered the buyer because they asked so many questions about generic versions of heart medication. Dylan's whole body went rigid, and he stared at the detective like she'd just shot him. Everyone else went quiet, waiting for him to explode, but instead, he sank down onto the nearest pew and put his head in his hands. After what felt like forever, he looked up and said, yeah, he bought those pills. He was trying to find cheaper options for his mom because she kept crying about not being able to afford her prescriptions. Uncle Robert cleared his throat, and everyone turned to look at him. His face was red and sweaty, and he kept pulling at his tie like it was choking him. He admitted he told Dylan's mom to stop wasting money on name-brand drugs when generics worked just as good. Said she was being dramatic about needing specific brands. Sarah started crying then, real ugly crying with snot and everything, and between sobs, she confessed she told her aunt to skip doses sometimes to make the bottles last longer. She thought missing a pill here and there wouldn't matter that much, especially when money was so tight. More people started talking over each other, admitting things they'd said or done. Someone told her to try herbal supplements instead. Another person said they gave her advice about cutting pills in half to stretch them out. The old woman near the back admitted she told Dylan's mom that doctors overprescribe anyway, and she probably didn't need half of what they gave her. Each confession hit Dylan like a physical blow, and he kept flinching, his hands gripping the edge of the pew so hard his knuckles went white. The detective was writing everything down, her face getting more and more concerned as the picture came together. All these people giving conflicting medical advice to a sick woman who just wanted help paying for her medicine. Dylan stood up suddenly, and everyone stepped back, but he just walked to his mother's casket and put both hands on it, his whole body shaking now. The detective approached him carefully and suggested maybe this wasn't murder at all, just a horrible accident caused by poverty and too many people thinking they knew better than doctors. She asked Dylan to unlock the doors so they could investigate properly without anyone being held against their will. Dylan nodded, but said he needed everyone to say it out loud first, to admit what they did to his mother. One by one, people stepped forward. Anna admitted she ignored her aunt's calls because she was tired of hearing about money problems. Uncle Robert said he called her a burden to her face the last time they talked. Sarah confessed she blocked her number after too many late-night crying calls. Each admission made made Dylan sink lower until he was basically collapsed against the casket. When everyone else had spoken, all eyes turned to me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the $200 Anna gave me, the bills damp with sweat from being clutched so tight. I walked to the front and put the money on the pew next to Dylan, then told everyone Anna paid me to be here because she was worried about how an empty funeral would look. The whole room went silent, and Anna's face turned bright red. She rushed forward and tried to grab the money, saying I should keep it, that she was sorry, that she didn't mean for things to go this way. I pushed her hand away and said the money should go to getting Dylan's mom a real headstone instead of whatever cheap marker they were planning. It felt like the smallest, most useless gesture, but I didn't know what else to do. Dylan picked up the bills and stared at them like he'd never seen money before, then looked at Anna with this expression that was somehow worse than anger. The detective gently took the money from Dylan's hand and put it in an evidence bag, saying they'd need to document everything for the investigation. Dylan finally walked to the main door and unlocked it with shaking hands, then went back to sit next to his mother's casket while people started filing out. Most of them couldn't even look at him as they passed. Anna tried to approach him, but he held up one hand without looking at her, and she stopped, then turned and basically ran out of the church. I stood there not knowing if I should leave or stay, watching Dylan sit alone with his dead mother while the detective made phone calls and the priest started cleaning up the broken vase. Dylan stood up slowly and walked back to the front doors, pulling the key from his pocket with shaking hands. He turned it in the lock and stepped aside as people rushed out like water breaking through a dam. I stayed in my pew, watching everyone push past each other to escape. The detective put her phone away and nodded at two officers who entered carefully through the open doors. They approached Dylan with their hands visible but ready, speaking to him in calm voices I couldn't quite hear. He didn't fight when they took the knife from his jacket, just handed it over handle first and let them guide him outside. The church emptied fast after that, leaving just me, the priest, and a few officers taking pictures of everything. Detective Cardenas walked over to my pew and asked me to come give my statement at the station. I followed her out past the broken flowers and overturned chairs, past Dylan sitting in the back of a police car, staring at nothing. At the station, she led me to a small room that smelled like old coffee and had me write down everything that happened. When I got to the part about Anna paying me to attend, she stopped writing and looked up at me with this disappointed expression. She said I could face charges for false representation at a funeral, that what I did was fraud, even if I didn't know things would go bad. She told me I should have known better than to take money to pretend to grieve someone I never met. I handed over the $200 from my pocket and she put it in an evidence bag, saying it would be returned to Anna's family. Outside the station, I watched them load Dylan into an ambulance instead of taking him to jail. The paramedics were gentle with him, talking softly as they helped him onto the stretcher. His family stood around the parking lot in small groups, some still arguing about what he'd said in the church, others just standing there looking lost. Anna walked up to me near my car, her makeup running down her face in black streaks. She started saying she was sorry for getting me involved, but then tried to explain why it mattered, so much that the funeral looked respectable. She kept talking about family reputation and how empty funerals reflected badly on everyone, like that justified putting me in danger. I got in my car without saying anything and drove away while she was still talking. The parking lot was full of police cars and people who'd heard something happened and came to watch. They had no idea about the knife or the locked doors or how scared everyone had been inside. 3 days later, a court officer knocked on my door with a subpoena, requiring me to testify at the inquest into Dylan's mother's death. Detective Cardenas called that afternoon to explain they'd found evidence of medical neglect by the family, but no signs of intentional murder. She said Dylan's mother had needed expensive treatments the family refused to help pay for, and she died alone in her house after rationing her medication to make it last longer. The detective said my testimony about what happened at the funeral would be important for understanding Dylan's mental state. Over the next few days, Anna left 7 voicemails on my phone, each one more angry than the last. First, she demanded I return the money even though the police already had it. Then she threatened to sue me for emotional distress and defamation of character. The way Dylan's whole body language changed when he heard about that pharmacy near Shady Oaks really makes me wonder what was going through his mind in that exact moment. Did he realize right then that his mom died because everyone, including him, was trying? In the last message, she said I'd ruined her family's reputation and she'd make sure everyone knew what kind of person I was. I saved all the messages in case I needed them as evidence of our original deal. My neighbor asked if I was okay because I looked tired, and I realized I hadn't been sleeping well since the funeral. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back in that church with Dylan standing between us and the door. I kept hearing the sound of the lock turning and feeling that trapped panic all over again. 2 weeks after the funeral, I still woke up sweating from dreams about being locked in small spaces. I'd already decided to tell the truth at the inquest about everything, including why I was really at that funeral. Maybe admitting my part in the whole mess would help me stop feeling so guilty about taking that money. The inquest was scheduled for next month, and I spent a lot of time thinking about what I'd say. Part of me wanted to protect Anna despite everything, but I knew lying under oath would only make things worse. Dylan deserved to have the whole truth come out about how his family treated his mother, even if that truth included me pretending to care about a woman I'd never met. Thanks for sticking around while I rambled through all these random questions. Hopefully my curiosity wasn't too much. I'll catch you in the next one. Like the video, it helps more than you think.